Formula One is staring down a potential technical earthquake that could flip the championship on its head, and it all revolves around a piece of bodywork that's supposed to make the cars faster, not send them spiraling into a barrier. Max Verstappen walked away from two terrifying crashes in the span of a month, both tied directly to a rotating rear wing failure, and I don't think anyone who saw that Silverstone impact can forget just how helpless that Red Bull looked as it snapped sideways. His own words afterward, calling the situation super dangerous, should be enough to make your stomach drop, because when a four-time world champion says something feels outright unsafe, you listen. In this deep dive, I'm going to unpack exactly what the FIA is demanding from Ferrari and Red Bull right now, the hidden aerodynamic trap that the current 400 millisecond rule completely fails to address, and the real reason McLaren is lurking in the background with their own version, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But I'll leave you with a question about the physics of airflow reattachment that even the brightest engineers in the paddock can't fully predict yet. Before we get to that, you need to understand why this rotating rear wing concept, which has somehow picked up the nickname the Macarena wing, because yes, it dances in a way that would make a 90s wedding reception proud, has turned into the single most controversial technical innovation of the 2026 season. I've been covering Formula One for years, and I can tell you, the moment Ferrari rolled out a rear wing that could physically rotate to a more aggressive angle during pre-season testing in Bahrain, I knew we were in for a regulatory showdown. And the fact that Red Bull showed up in Miami with their own interpretation that spins in the complete opposite direction only accelerated the drama. Because that's not just two teams copying each other, that's two engineering philosophies colliding at over 200 miles an hour, and one of them, according to the mounting evidence, has a habit of leaving its driver as a passenger. The Macarena wing is essentially an active aerodynamic device that goes way beyond the old DRS system we all got used to, opening up a much larger gap in the rear wing to slash drag on the straights. And while the rulebook allows a flap to move between two fixed positions with a maximum transition time of 400 milliseconds, the real-world airflow doesn't care about a stopwatch. It cares about whether the air can actually reattach smoothly after the wing slams shut. And that's the terrifying loophole that has Red Bull and the FIA burning the midnight oil. What makes this story so compelling is that Ferrari has been running their version since Miami without a single technical hiccup, no uncommanded openings, no loss of rear stability mid-corner, while Red Bull's wing, which technical director Pierre Wache has openly described as more aggressive in the size of its opening and therefore capable of shedding even more drag, has now suffered two distinct failures on Verstappen's car alone, one at the Red Bull ring in Spielberg, and then that frightening moment at Silverstone that left the world champion pointing fingers. When Laurent Mekies, the Red Bull team principal, stood in front of the cameras on Sunday evening and promised they would leave no stone unturned, I believed him, because the stakes are not just about this year's Constructors' Trophy. They're about whether the team can trust their own car at Spa-Francorchamps next week, a circuit famous for flat-out corners like Eau Rouge and Blanchimont, where a sudden loss of rear downforce doesn't just ruin your lap, it puts you in the hospital. Now, here's where the FIA's involvement shifts from a routine technical inquiry to something that could genuinely rewrite the regulation book mid-season. According to a report from motorsport.com that broke earlier today, the governing body has formally contacted both Ferrari and Red Bull to request additional information about the design, operation, and failure modes of these rotating rear wings. And while the FIA's stated goal at this stage is simply to verify that both teams fully comply with all existing safety requirements, I think we all know that when the rule makers start asking for deep data dumps on a system that has already caused two high-speed crashes, the conversation very quickly moves from compliance to whether the entire concept needs to be restrained or even banned outright. This is where I need to inject a little bit of my own perspective, because I genuinely love the engineering creativity that teams pour into these cars, and I firmly believe that pushing the boundaries of a rulebook is the soul of Formula One.
But the moment a clever interpretation starts producing failures that drivers themselves label as super dangerous, we've crossed a line from innovation into recklessness. And that's not a biased take. That's just recognizing that no championship point is worth watching a driver get stretchered away while his rear wing is still flapping like a broken bird. The FIA's technical regulation on this matter is remarkably specific, yet, in hindsight, may be dangerously incomplete, stating that any adjustment of the RWF flap may only be controlled by the FIA standard ECU and must have a maximum transition time between the two fixed positions that does not exceed 400 milliseconds, measured from the instant the command is issued until the position sensor confirms the commanded position has been reached. If you read that sentence a couple of times, you start to realize the problem, and I want to walk you through it slowly, because it's the kind of detail that will absolutely determine whether Red Bull ends up with a penalty, a forced redesign, or a full concept ban. That 400 millisecond window governs how quickly the wing must physically move from one extreme to the other, but nowhere does it mandate that the airflow,
the actual invisible hand that keeps the car glued to the asphalt, must be fully reattached and stable by the time the clock stops ticking. And that delay between mechanical closure and aerodynamic recovery is the silent assassin sitting in the back of Verstappen's car. Imagine you're flying down the Hanger Straight at Silverstone at 210 miles per hour. The wing rotates open to dump drag. You hit the braking zone. The system commands the flap to close. The sensor confirms it's in the high downforce position within 400 milliseconds, but the turbulent air behind the wing takes maybe another 100 or 200 milliseconds to settle back into a smooth, attached flow. And during that tiny, almost imperceptible gap, the rear tires have nothing like the downforce they expect. And if you're already turning into a corner, you're basically asking physics to take the wheel. That's not a failure of a sensor or an actuator. That's a failure of the rule to account for the messy reality of aerodynamics. And it's exactly the kind of gray area that has historically led to huge controversies in this sport, from mass dampers to double diffusers to the DAS system. Except those were performance gains, and this one involves a car swapping ends with zero warning. I can tell you with a high degree of confidence, based on conversations I've had with aerodynamicists who are not involved in this story but understand these systems intimately, that the attachment delay is not a theoretical problem. It's a measurable phenomenon that can easily exceed the mechanical transition time, especially when a wing is as large and aggressively profiled as the Red Bull version, which rotates in a direction that the team hoped would maximize the drag reduction effect, but might have inadvertently created a longer aerodynamic recovery tail. That's a detail the FIA will be scrutinizing heavily, because the initial request for information is, according to sources, targeted not just at the mechanical compliance data, but also at the team's computational fluid dynamics models and wind tunnel correlation figures that show exactly how the airflow behaves during that transition. And if the data reveals that Red Bull's wing leaves the car in a temporarily unstable state, even while technically satisfying the letter of the law, the governing body would have every justification to step in, either by mandating a longer minimum closure window that includes aerodynamic stabilization, or by requiring additional fail-safe mechanisms that guarantee downforce is restored before the driver can physically lean on the rear tires. That's the part that keeps me up at night as a fan who also cares deeply about driver safety, because you don't want to wait for a third incident at a place like Spa, where a rear wing-related snap at Raidillon would be catastrophic. You might be wondering why the FIA has so far limited this inquiry to Ferrari and Red Bull and hasn't yet dragged McLaren into the same conversation, and the answer is both simple and telling. McLaren, under the technical leadership of Andrea Stella, brought their own rotating rear wing design to the Austrian Grand Prix as a development piece, but according to reports, the team never considered it ready for use, not even during a free practice session, because their own internal testing had flagged concerns about the very aerodynamic reattachment issue we've been discussing.
That's a fascinating detail, because it suggests that while Ferrari found a solution that works cleanly, and Red Bull took a more aggressive path that has now backfired twice, McLaren looked at their data and decided to hit pause, essentially self-regulating before the FIA had to come knocking. I spoke to a source close to the team who indicated that the Woking squad plans to potentially debut the wing during the Belgian Grand Prix weekend, but only if they can demonstrate with telemetry and track runs that the airflow reattaches consistently under all conditions, including gusty crosswinds that can disrupt the wing's wake even further. That puts McLaren in a uniquely powerful position, because if the FIA tightens the regulations in a way that bans the Red Bull interpretation but allows the more conservative Ferrari approach to continue, McLaren's delayed introduction could turn out to be a strategic masterstroke, handing them a performance advantage at the high-speed circuits that dominate the second half of the calendar, without ever having risked a driver's neck to get there. Meanwhile, Red Bull is facing an impossible choice ahead of Spa, because on one hand, they absolutely need the straight-line speed that the Macarena wing provides to defend against the resurgent Ferraris and the ever-improving Mercedes. But on the other hand, Laurent Mekies himself admitted during the Silverstone debrief that the team will review the full area to make sure there is zero chance of a repeat. And if they cannot achieve that level of certainty in a week, running the system again would be an act of either supreme confidence or dangerous desperation. I've seen a lot of Red Bull engineering over the years, and if Pierre Wash and his team trace the failures to two separate root causes, as they have internally claimed, that's actually worse news than a single fixable flaw, because it means the system has multiple failure modes, and hunting down every possible trigger in a device that sits in the turbulent wake of a Formula One car is like trying to debug a piece of software while the computer is on fire. The FIA's investigation will likely look at the sensor data from both crashes to determine whether the wing ever reached the commanded position, and if it did, whether the subsequent loss of grip was due to the aerodynamic recovery gap I described, or an entirely different failure, such as a mechanical jam that left the wing stuck in its low drag state without the driver knowing, which would be an even clearer-cut violation of the requirement to have a fail-safe default to the high downforce position.
Want to take a moment here to add a layer of analysis that I think you'll find valuable, because the rotating wing debate is not happening in a vacuum. It's part of the broader 2026 regulation overhaul that introduced active aerodynamics for the first time in a major way. And the Macarena wing is essentially a clever exploitation of the rule that permits a rear wing flap to have two distinct positions with a regulated transition time, originally intended for DRS-style activation on straights. The teams figured out that if you rotate the entire wing assembly, not just a small flap, you could create a much larger reduction in drag without the need for a separate DRS mechanism. And because the rules didn't explicitly prohibit rotation in a direction that opens a bigger slot gap, Ferrari and then Red Bull pushed the concept through a loophole that the FIA likely never intended to be stretched this far. That's not a criticism of the teams. I actually admire the ingenuity, but the FIA now finds itself in a classic game of regulatory whack-a-mole, where the letter of the law is being followed while the spirit of the safety framework is hanging by a thread. If you've been following the sport long enough, you'll remember the 2010 blown diffuser saga or the 2012 double DRS controversy, where clever engineers found ways to make the car do things the rule makers hadn't envisioned. But in those cases, the risk was to performance, not to the driver's well-being, and that changes the calculus dramatically. Here's the thing that I find both amusing and slightly terrifying in equal measure. The fact that this rotating wing has been dubbed the Macarena wing has turned a deeply serious technical investigation into something that sounds like a dance challenge. And I have to admit, I caught myself humming the song while researching the failure modes, which is probably not what Verstappen was doing as he spun backward at Copse. But humor aside, the name reflects how quickly the paddock can latch on to a trend.
And with McLaren now poised to become the third team to adopt the concept, we're at a crossroads where the FIA has to decide whether to let all teams develop their own variations, potentially leading to a grid-wide arms race where half the field could face similar failures on a weekly basis, or to draw a firm line in the sand before the Belgian Grand Prix. The most extreme scenario that sources have mentioned, and I want to be clear this is not yet on the table but is being discussed in engineering circles, is that the FIA could use its authority under the safety regulations to temporarily suspend the use of any rotating rear wing that operates beyond a certain deflection angle, effectively banning the Red Bull and potentially the Ferrari version, unless they can be proven to deliver downforce recovery within a new, stricter metric that includes aerodynamic attachment time. That would be a seismic decision because it would rip out a significant chunk of straight-line performance from the two leading teams and potentially hand the advantage to Mercedes or Aston Martin, who have so far stayed out of this particular technology race. And it would raise serious questions about whether championship points scored with the wing should be reviewed. I'm not suggesting that will happen, but when you've got a world champion saying his car is super dangerous and a governing body that has recently shown a willingness to intervene on safety grounds, as they did with the porpoising interventions in 2022, nothing is off the table. The timeline for all of this is incredibly compressed because the FIA's current phase is strictly an information-gathering exercise, which means they will likely issue a technical directive later this week after reviewing the submitted data, and that directive could range from a clarification of the existing rule to a full-blown mandatory modification that requires the wing to be locked in the high downforce position until further notice. I can almost guarantee that the Red Bull and Ferrari factories are running non-stop simulations right now to prepare for every possible outcome, because the difference between keeping the Macarena wing and losing it could be worth 0.3 of a second per lap at a track like Monza, which is an eternity in modern Formula One. And that brings me to the human element of this story, which is often lost in the technical jargon. Max Verstappen is not a driver who complains lightly. He's known for being brutally direct, but also for trusting his car to the absolute limit. And the fact that behind the scenes, according to reports, his frustration is growing suggests that the failures at Austria and Silverstone shook his confidence in the rear-end stability in a way that we rarely see from a driver of his caliber. When you hear Laurent Mekies talking about leaving zero chance for a repeat, you're hearing the echo of that frustration, because a driver who doesn't trust his equipment is a driver who will leave time on the table, and with the championship battle tightening, Red Bull simply cannot afford to give away points because their trick rear wing decides to go rogue at the worst possible moment. If I were in that garage, I'd be pushing for a conservative configuration at Spa, swallowing the straight-line deficit and focusing on keeping the car out of the barriers, while the engineering team runs back-to-back rig tests to replicate the attachment delay under every conceivable yaw and ride height condition, because the alternative is a DNF that could hand the title lead to Charles Leclerc, or, if McLaren finally unleashes its own wing, to Lando Norris. That's the strategic chess match underneath the technical inquiry, and it's exactly why I love this sport, because every decision has layers upon layers of consequence. Now, I promised you I'd leave one question unanswered, and it's the one that's...
The engineers at Ferrari, Red Bull, and McLaren are currently losing sleep over, can you actually guarantee with complete certainty that airflow will reattach smoothly within a specified time window across the entire operating range of a car that's bouncing over curbs, dealing with dirty air from a leading car, and experiencing rapid changes in ride height, all while the rear wing is pivoting through an aggressive angle at over 200 miles per hour? The honest answer, if you talk to any aerodynamicist off the record, is that you can get very close, you can simulate it, you can wind tunnel test it, but the real-world variability of track conditions introduces a probability cloud that no amount of sensors can fully eliminate, and that inherent uncertainty is what the FIA now has to confront, because regulating a mechanical transition time is easy. Regulating the behavior of a turbulent fluid that doesn't care about your rulebook is a whole different ballgame. As I wrap this up, I want to give you my own take, and I'll phrase it as a fellow enthusiast who's been watching these cars evolve for decades.
I think the Macarena wing is a brilliant piece of engineering, and I genuinely hope the FIA finds a way to keep the concept alive with additional safety parameters rather than resorting to an outright ban, because Formula One is at its best when teams exploit gray areas to push the performance envelope, but that excitement cannot come at the cost of seeing a driver in the wall because a wing decided to take a fraction of a second longer than expected to settle down. A potential solution, and I'm just spitballing here, would be to mandate a minimum stabilization delay after the position sensor confirms closure, essentially adding a buffer that ensures downforce is fully re-established before the car enters a braking zone, which would allow the clever aerodynamic gains while closing the most dangerous gap. Whether the FIA will go that route or reach for a heavier hammer remains to be seen, but the next few days will define not just the championship fight, but also the direction of active aero development for years to come. Because if the Macarena wing gets neutered, teams will think twice before chasing similar concepts in 2027. And if it gets a clean bill of health with tighter oversight, you can bet every single team on the grid will have their own version by Singapore. That's the double-edged sword of innovation in a sport that moves as fast as the cars themselves. The key takeaway here is that the FIA's investigation is not yet a crisis, but it has all the ingredients to become one if the data reveals systemic shortcomings. And with Red Bull's internal review running in parallel, we are about to find out whether the Macarena wing is a fleeting dance number or a permanent fixture that's just missing a few critical beats. Keep your eyes on the news coming out of the FIA technical headquarters in Geneva, because when that technical directive drops, it could scramble the order faster than a first-lap pileup in the rain. And here's what I'll leave you with. Do you believe rotating wings should be temporarily banned until a more robust aerodynamic recovery rule is in place, or is this just a case of Red Bull pushing too hard and paying the price? Because that debate is going to rage on in every forum and paddock bench until the lights go out at Spa. There's a bigger picture, too, that we haven't touched on yet, and it's the commercial and competitive pressure that these teams face. Because when Ferrari introduced their Macarena wing, it was a clear signal that they had found a performance differentiator, and you can be absolutely sure that the boardroom at Red Bull demanded an answer immediately, which might explain why Pierre Wash's version, developed since November 2025 according to his own timeline, was rushed onto the car in Miami with an aggression level that they now recognize might have been too bold. The difference between a concept working on the dyno and working in the turbulent wake of a Formula One car at race speeds is vast, and I sometimes wonder if the compressed development cycles of the modern cost cap era are pushing teams to take shortcuts in validation that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. That's not an excuse for the failures, but it's a contextual reality that I think fans deserve to understand, because it's not just about engineers making mistakes, it's about an ecosystem that rewards rapid deployment and punishes conservatism. And the FIA has to be the grown-up in the room when that ecosystem starts producing dangerously unstable cars. I can tell you that if the investigation ultimately finds that Red Bull complied with every existing rule, and yet the failure still occurred, that would be a damning indictment of the regulation itself, not the team, and it would force the governing body to rewrite that section of the technical rules with an urgency we haven't seen since the Halo introduction. That would also likely trigger a wave of protests from rival teams who might argue that Red Bull gained an unfair performance advantage during races where the wing worked perfectly, and that kind of retrospective points adjustment is the last thing anyone wants in a season that's already shaping up to be one of the most competitive in recent memory. The FIA's preference, according to insiders, is to find a collaborative solution that keeps the technology on track while eliminating the danger, because banning it outright would not only anger Red Bull and Ferrari, but also discourage other teams from investing in active aero solutions that are supposed to be a cornerstone of the next regulation cycle. There's an irony in all of this that I can't let pass without comment, and it's the very same aerodynamicists who are now frantically modeling attachment delays were 6 months ago celebrating the Macarena wing as a masterstroke of rule interpretation. And that's the nature of innovation in a sport that operates at the edge of physics. Sometimes you don't know you've gone too far until the tire marks are on the wall and the data logger is screaming. As a journalist and a fan, I'm cautiously optimistic that the FIA's measured approach, requesting information rather than issuing immediate penalties, signals a genuine desire to understand the problem fully before acting, which is exactly what you want from a regulator. But I'm also acutely aware that every day that passes without a definitive answer is another day that teams could be walking into a race weekend with a wing that has a non-zero probability of causing a third incident, and that's the race against time that nobody is winning right now.